Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is HarrisX founder and CEO, Dritan Esho. Dritan, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me back, Brittany.
It is another exciting day, fresh off the press, a new HarrisX Forbes poll. It's wide-ranging. We're talking TikTok, immigration, but first up, President Biden. You have a new updated approval rating. What is it?
So, President Biden didn't get a bump after the State of the Union, but it seems like the $30 million that his campaign has been spending since then is really starting to move the dial. The last time we polled his job approval a few weeks ago, he was at 37%. Today, he's at 41% and has moved up just a bit by about 4 percentage points. And that's a statistically relevant move, and it's also a move that has been picked up by other polls that have come out in the last week or 10 days.
That sounds like good news for President Biden. A 4 percentage point bump sounds pretty sizable. Is there any indication as to why voters are feeling that he's doing a better job than they have in recent times?
Well, look, I think you have to keep it in context, right? He's still at 41%. He's still significantly underwater, and he's showing real softness with women voters. In some polls, like the most recent Economist YouGov poll, his approval with men was actually higher than his approval with women. A similar picture was in the Harvard-Harris poll, which is a different poll that we conduct with Harvard University. So there's still a lot to worry in the polls. That being said, where the president is really picking up steam is really with undecided voters or voters on the fence. Before, him and Trump were essentially getting half of undecideds breaking one way and the other half breaking another way. Now, President Biden is picking up the lion's share of those undecided voters, roughly 3 and 4 of those voters. And that's really what has started to make the difference for him and why sentiments have started to ameliorate and become better for him. But he's still, a little ways off from actually being within range of 50% approval, where he would be comfortable heading into the reelection.
Let's talk about that reelection. Let's talk about the horse race. First, starting out with Trump versus Biden, both parties' presumptive nominees. Last time you and I spoke, Trump was beating Biden in a head-to-head matchup. What's it looking like now?
So when you account for leaners, they are essentially tied right now. And again, part of the positive news for President Biden's reelection effort is that he's now winning independent leaners or independents who are on the fence, and they're now starting to break for him. And as I mentioned, he's also winning 3 out of 4 undecideds. When you remove leaners or undecideds, essentially Trump is still up by about 3 points, which is within the margin of error of our poll, and about 11% of the electorate is really on the fence, and they still haven't made up their mind. But this is a big improvement from our last poll as well, where essentially Trump was up by 2 to 3 points, and that was only a few weeks ago. So everything that we're seeing suggests that President Biden is starting to move the dial. I personally attribute this to him being up on air with this $30 million spend, which is a huge spend out of the gate. And it seems to be working, and it seems to be moving some of those voters who are on the fence or yet to make up their mind on his camp. Now, is this a sustained pickup or not? That's yet to be seen, right? It could just be the effect of that campaign being up on air and steadily hitting voters on the fence.
When you add the leaners into the mix, things are looking better for President Biden. But how much can a candidate statistically and historically count on leaners to show up on Election Day?
Well, leaners matter I would say at the extremes, right? If it's a high turnout election, then those who are on the fence, understanding how they will break, usually in the last month or two before the election, that's very important because that tends to make a big difference. In this election, we're still seeing a majority of voters, close to two-thirds of voters, saying that they don't want a rematch of 2020. So it's much more likely to be a low turnout election, a race to the bottom, as it's been described by some commentators looking at what they're seeing. And in that case, those who are undecided, even though they're not that many, because most undecideds will just sit it out, still end up making the difference. Everything that we're seeing and we have consistently been seeing for over years suggests that in a head to head matchup between Biden and Trump, the election is going to come down to a few thousand votes, or it's going to be a razor thin election overall. So the undecideds, they matter a lot, and it's important to track them very closely.
So now let's widen the pool a little bit here. What happens when you throw independents Cornel West and RFK Jr., as well as Green Party candidate Jill Stein into the mix here?
Sure. So with undecideds, it doesn't really change the relative strength of Trump v. Biden. Trump is at 40%, Biden is at 37%, so 3 points off, as we see in our horse race question with undecideds, the head-to-head horse race question with undecideds. And then essentially the third-party candidates are picking up about 14% of the vote, with RFK Jr. having the lion share of that, 12% out of the 14%, and then a small share of the vote, 1% for Cornel West, 1% for Jill Stein, and 8% of voters who are still on the fence and yet to make up their mind. Now, if you add in leaners into that mix, the picture changes a little bit, but not that much. Trump is at 42%, Biden is at 40%, RFK picks up a little bit, he's at 14%, Jill Stein moves up to 2%, and Cornel West moves up to 2%. So compared to the head-to-head matchup, it's not a tie, it's Trump +2, but that's within the statistical margin of error. So essentially, the introduction of the third party tickets or options into the horse race doesn't really change the picture that much for Biden and Trump. And this is indicative or reflective of the fact that both Biden and Trump, they're essentially doubling down on their bases and not going necessarily after swing voters or undecided voters in the middle. And those swing voters and those undecided voters are really looking for an alternative choice or selection in the upcoming election.
A theme that has come up in our conversations, a theme that has come up in conversations I've had with political commentators, people from both sides of the aisle, is that many Americans do not want another 2020 rematch, yet here we are, and the poll posed a really interesting question about second choices. This was the question: if Donald Trump is unable to run for president in 2024, who would you vote for in the GOP primary? What did you find when you asked this question?
Absolutely. So it's actually a quite interesting result. Republicans' second choice would actually be Ron DeSantis, and he comes in at 29% of the GOP vote. Then he's followed up by Nikki Haley at 18%, and Vivek Ramaswamy then is third at 12%. This is important because if Trump is not in the picture, then actually Republican voters gravitate a lot more around policies and issues than they do on personalities. And both DeSantis and Haley, they tend to be more moderate than some of the other candidates that ran within the Republican field. And so they are number one and number two in terms of the next choice if Trump is unable to run in the election. So an interesting picture. You don't really see the other MAGA candidates pop up to the top, you see more moderate candidates pop up to the top.
You also, on the flip side, posed the question, if Joe Biden is unable to run, who would be your second choice? What did you find there?
So 24% of Democrats would go for Vice President Harris. 14% say that they actually are unsure. They don't know who they would vote for. So that's the second highest answer. And then 11% each of those voters, of Democratic voters, gravitate either with Bernie Sanders or with Hillary Clinton. So again, none of these second choices are really slam dunk on both the Republican side or on the Democratic side. We have asked in other polls, do voters, both GOP voters and Democratic voters, would they prefer a contested nomination if the flag bearer, Trump or Biden, are unable to run or not, and they would actually prefer a contested nomination in and around the conventions. So, aside from the two leading candidates, no one really has a clear grasp on either of the parties or on their bases.
What's really interesting is that most Democrats' second choice would be Kamala Harris, the vice president, who throughout the past months, perhaps year even, has seen a lower approval rating than President Biden. So why are they gravitating towards her?
Well, I think that it's a lot of Biden's voters that gravitate towards her. Now, the conversion there is not very good. I mean, if you ask, or when we were asking, when it was still a competitive primary, what percentage of Democrats would pick President Biden versus an alternative, it was roughly around 70% of Democrats that would pick President Biden. And so she's converting a little over a third of Biden's base into her base. Those are not great numbers, right? And that shows that the fact that the vice president has had actually a lower job approval rating and has lower favorability with both Democratic voters and voters overall than the president does himself.
I do now want to pivot to the issues. Let's start with immigration. Immigration continues to be one of the top issues facing voters. Republicans and Democrats alike have been pointing across the aisle, blaming each other when it comes to this. Republicans have continued to tell me that every state is a border state. So you posed this question to voters. What do voters think about Biden's record? What did you find out?
President Biden's record on immigration in the eyes of voters is not a good record, and that's no surprise. In our last poll, immigration was the top issue in the country, and it's still the top issue in the country, above inflation, above jobs, and the core tabletop issues that tend to define elections. So this is not a slipper issue anymore, and it makes sense because there's over 10 million undocumented immigrants that have entered the country in the last several years. And we followed up our State of the Union polling together with some questions around immigration, and it pretty much shows that 2/3 of Americans think that the border or issues around the border are getting worse, including 46% of Democratic voters. 3 and 4, 75%, would make it tougher to get into the U.S. Illegally, and a slight majority, 52%, believe that Biden has all the powers that he needs to secure the border. The issue is splits amongst political lines, but independents break with Republicans, thinking that President Biden is able to act on this issue. And again, 75% say that we should call the problem what it is, a problem of illegal immigrants coming into the country, and it's starting to become less of a political issue than it was before. There's a certain growing number of voters within each of the parties that are starting to say we have to do something when it comes to immigration.
I want to talk about a subset within this issue, and that is the rhetoric, how we talk about migrants, about people who enter the country illegally. And President Biden addressed immigration in his State of the Union address, and he blamed his predecessor as well as Republicans for tanking a bipartisan border deal. He also invoked Laken Riley, a Georgia nursing student who was murdered allegedly by a migrant who was here illegally, and he said this, quote, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. And your poll posed a question about this type of rhetoric. You asked this: is it appropriate or inappropriate to refer to those who enter the United States without permission as illegal aliens? What do voters think about that?
Well, voters agree that it's appropriate to call undocumented immigrants illegal aliens. 75% say yes. And frankly, it's a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that agree with it. So it's not a political issue. The labels, the rhetoric are not a political issue. What voters took exception to with President Biden is the fact that President Biden reversed his position on the issue, right, and said it was a mistake to call Riley's killer an illegal. And he came under a lot of criticism from Republicans, but also across the political spectrum for having flip-flopped on that or changed his position on that. And a strong majority of voters believed that that criticism was warranted, and they approved of it. They believe that the president should have remained consistent with both the rhetoric and the labels that he used, but also, addressing the issue, right? Which it has been is yet to be done, despite news that the White House is considering a wide-ranging number of executive actions around the immigration issue.
Do voters have the sense that President Biden has all the powers that he needs to secure the border?
Again, it splits politically, very heavily political. If you're a Democrat, you stick to the party line. You say, no, he doesn't have the powers that he needs. If you're a Republican, you say, yes, he does have the powers that he needs. Really, the important voter segment here are independents. And independents tend to believe that Biden has the powers that he needs to start taking action on this issue.
I now want to talk about TikTok, so let's switch gears a little bit here. As we know, this has made headlines in recent weeks after Congress passed a bipartisan bill that gave TikTok's parent company ByteDance an ultimatum. That ultimatum would either force ByteDance to divest TikTok or TikTok would be banned from the United States. What do voters think about this specific legislation?
Well, I will say that majorities of voters across all parties support the divestiture bill, the bill that just passed in Congress that would force the sale of TikTok to a US-based conglomerate or corporation. 72% of Republicans support the bill, 63% of Democrats, and 59% of independents. So it's less of a political issue across party lines than it is a generational issue. Any action that might be taken around TikTok. And so the biggest differences that we see, it's actually between generations rather than political leaning.
I'm sure it's a generational issue when you posed the question if TikTok has had a positive or negative impact on Americans who used the app. What did you find there?
So overall, 45% said mostly positive, 55% said mostly negative, right? So the majority of public opinion is that TikTok's effects on society are mostly negative rather than positive. However, as I mentioned, when you look at it by generation, 2/3 of 18 to 34-year-olds, essentially Gen Zers and younger millennials, say that it has a positive effect. And a little bit less than 6 in 10 of 35 to 49-year-olds say the same. When you go to older voting groups, 50 plus, then the proportions flip, and a majority of those older voting groups, a solid majority, actually think that it's mostly has had a negative impact. And these types of responses tend to be consistent. And again, when you look at it politically, Republicans and independents tend to think that TikTok has mostly been negative for Americans. Democrats slightly say positive, but it's the generational differences that are really making the difference in the responses.
A bipartisan group of lawmakers have also called TikTok a national security threat since its parent company is China based. Do Americans and voters in general agree with that sentiment?
They do. And it's a majority across the board. 68% of Republicans, 58% of Democrats, and 60% of independents.
And like I said, ByteDance was given that ultimatum, divest or TikTok's banned from the United States. Who do Americans want to buy TikTok?
Well, if you've seen the news, there is a consortium led by uh, former President Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, that wants to buy TikTok and is already considering fielding offers or has already made some kind of an offer. 42% would support that. The majority either do not or are yet to be convinced. However, most Americans, a clear majority of Americans, would love if TikTok is acquired by one of the big technology companies, Amazon, Microsoft, or Apple. Incidentally, these big technology companies also have very high trust scores with the American public. And so it's directly correlated with how much trust you have in the possible third party that is looking to buy the platform. So it's an interesting picture. On one side, consumers and voters are concerned about the concentration of market power when it comes to technology, and you're seeing a lot of antitrust action from the Biden administration on that issue. But on the other end, they feel a lot more safe and secure knowing that the social media platform of choice, or one of the key social media platforms in the country, is owned and operated by a trusted American technology corporation.
Dritan, per usual, thank you so much for coming on, breaking down the numbers for us. As I said, it was a very exciting day with this poll just coming out. I'm already looking forward to our next conversation.
Likewise, thank you so much.